To build our metal river table, we started with rough sawn flaming birch. We then took that to a carpenter who helped us mill it up so it was flat and square. We then brought it back to the shop and began to make our jig so that we could pour our epoxy. When pouring epoxy, you need to make sure that all of the edges are completely tight because it will leak out anywhere it can. So we lay out our boards where we want them. We then mark out where that is so that we can then take apart our jig, pull the boards off, and caulk underneath so that when we put the boards back down, we have a nice seal and the epoxy won't leak out. Once we have our seal, we then apply our clamps to keep everything locked in. Our next step is going to be to apply caulking into the ends because we're going to be using a metal and we want it to look like it goes all the way through. So as we pour our epoxy, we don't want it to go to the end. We then mixed up West System epoxy because it's fairly cheap compared to the metal. We then pour that in and torch off the bubbles. We let the epoxy dry overnight so that it can cure up well. Once it's cured up, we come back, we take the mold apart. You can see now we have a nice gap on the end and at the top so that when we pour our metal, it looks like it goes all the way through. So we want to clean up this edge real nice, and then we're going to re-caulk and put the mold back together. The metal is very runny and will leak out just as much, if not more, than the epoxy. So we're going to caulk that edge real nice so that nothing gets out. The next step is to mix up our metal. We're using Vero Metal Bronze. Vero Metal has two types of binder. One is for spraying, it's very thin. The other is for brushing and troweling, it's much thicker. We're using a 50-50 mixture of the two. Everything is measured very precisely. We add our catalyst, blend that together. We then mix up our metal powder with our binder, and the clock starts ticking. We have about 20 minutes before it sets up. So we begin to pour our metal river. Now we have that gap on the end, so water falls down, and now it looks like we have solid bronze all the way through. On this table, we ended up with a 1/4 inch and sometimes thicker spots of metal. On our next one, we would definitely do a thinner pour there. We then used a syringe and injected the liquid metal into this crack here. It filled the crack nicely. We keep it overflowed. Everything we want to stay positive so that we can sand it down later. After the Vero metal has cured up overnight, the majority of the work begins. We now need to sand and polish the wood. The Vero metal is actually metal, so it's not easy to sand. We use a belt sander with 40 grit, and we just go to town, knocking it down and trying to make it flat. When you do that, you end up making lots of scratch marks into the wood as you get it real flat. So then we sand extensively to get all those scratch marks out. We work our way up the grits, starting with 40 grit, going to 60, then 80, then 100, then 120. We then finish off with a 150 grit with the direction of the grain on this belt sander. We then vacuum everything and tack rag it all off. We're using Rubio pre-stain, so we add a little bit of water to this water-based stain, mix it up, and we're then going to apply it with a foam roller. Very important you take a scour pad or Scotch-Brite pad and work it in after. That knocks the grain down that rises up because of it's water-based. It also helps work the stain in. Once it's set, we then take terry cloths and wipe all the excess off. It's very important to keep a wet edge when applying stain. So we're going to work in manageable areas. In this case, we did one side at a time. We then do the exact same process with Scotch-Brite pad, terry cloth, wipe it all off so that we're ready for the next step, which is sanding and polishing the metal river. We're going to polish our metal up to 3000 grit. We started with 400 grit sandpaper and we stepped our way all the way up. We don't want to touch the wood, we want to leave that at 150 grit. Once we finish polishing our river, we mix up our Rubio monocoat and we apply that again with a white Scotch-Brite pad and then wipe the excess off with a terry cloth. We then use a fresh terry cloth and the sander to buff away any remaining oil. We had to use Simpson brackets to support our river in this case because we poured too thin of an epoxy and we didn't put any anchors in. In the future, we would correct that. We then went to Amazon and bought some legs. They're pre-made, pre-finished, they screw right on, and you end up with this beautiful table.